Hi, everybody. Last day of class. So, as a result, we're going to fix global poverty. That seems like a good way to sort of wrap things up. Um, as you saw in that last video, sort of how we talk about poverty, why poverty is important, et cetera, et cetera. At the global level, I mean, we kind of look around where we live and we see poverty all the time. But if you've ever traveled to sort of third world countries, you've seen like very different kinds of poverty. So let's talk about poverty and development very quickly. I'm going to give you today 4 big theories about how to fix it. And I'm going to have you guys choose which one you think is the best path to take. So development is a process of change that leads to well-being in people's lives. We've talked about this before, just a couple weeks ago, how we talk about that idea of well-being. Usually, again, we talked about this term HDI, Human Development Index, which talked about GDP, which talked about literacy, which talked about life expectancy, sort of healthy, wealthy, and wise. And there's this sort of expectation that if any or all of those things are improving for you, things are going good, well-being. So the question that we're going to have today is we're going to ask the question, how should foreign aid be spent to develop underdeveloped states? So we look around the world and we see these third world countries, a lot of the countries that were mentioned in the textbook chapter. And then we have foreign aid. And I think the compassionate side of us, the human side of us, would love to see countries like Burkina Faso and Botswana to actually see growth, economic growth. We would like to see the individuals in these countries experiencing sort of these things, and then the countries as a whole. So the question becomes, how do you do that? The United States can't go in and do that. The European Union can't go in and do that. The UN can't really go into these countries and do it for them. So the question is, how do those, the UN, the EU, the US, how do they give money to those countries with, what do they give the money for, with the idea of improving their healthy, wealthy, and wise? That's development. So what's the purpose of the aid? What's the conditions on the aid? So one of the things we're going to ask with each of these theories is, what do you think the reason why those countries are poor? Now, how do you spend foreign aid so that you could overcome that causal factor? And then the question of what should be done first. There's not infinite amount of money to spend on these things. There's not infinite amount of will to do this. So the question, you're going to look at these theories, you're going to say, I like 2 or 3 of these theories, and that's great. But the question is, with limited resources, what do you spend money on first? What has to happen first? And you'll see sort of how we talk about this here in a second. Just to sort of think about this from another perspective, this is, when we talk about absolute poverty, it's pretty clear that absolute poverty is going down. So what we mean by absolute poverty is we set this line. We say, I think the number is $2 a day, living on $2 a day. So people who live on $2 a day, if you're below, it's poverty, and then below, not poverty. It's a very, very low number, but of course there's some countries where $2 a day, it's still very little money, but it's doable, I guess is the way to say it, if you're okay with very, very scarce living conditions. So what we see is that if we have this as sort of our line, we say, here's the line, everybody below that line is poor. But now let's say that I said to you, okay, well, hold on a second, let's just look at this. What this shows us is, even though there's more people in the world, the number of those people who are living in absolute poverty are going down. We see this decline, especially since 1990. You see this very steady decline. You would expect this number to keep going down to some degree, though we may redefine what we mean by absolute poverty and it may go back up, but we'd still expect that to sort of be going like that. So this is good news. By any indication, this is good news. That means there's fewer people in the world living on less than $2 a day. But now let me say that I said to you, okay, you are now going to be living on $3 a day. That's going to be $3 a day for the rest of your life, or for the rest of the year. How would you feel about that? Would you feel like I can make it in the United States on $3 a day? Well, almost certainly you couldn't make it on $3 a day in the United States. And in a lot of places around the world, just because you're over this, just because I have $2.50 a day, doesn't mean I'm living a lifestyle of healthy, wealthy, and wise. It just means I'm not living a lifestyle of abject poverty. This is a great goal, but it's not exactly. We don't say the world is now awesome because we've achieved that. We can also look at this, and we can sort of see where has this decline largely happened. And there's no secret. It's this red area here. The red area, like the I don't know, tan area is a little bit less. The blue area is about the same, but it's this red area that's really gone from being this to this, and that's East Asia and the Pacific. And in particular, it is China and it is India that between them have roughly a third of the population of the earth. And because they've both been developing, they'd be in that last chapter that if we didn't have coronavirus, we would read that chapter. We're not going to read that chapter. Or you can read it on your own. We're not going to do it for class. But that's definitely sort of been where most of the decline in absolute poverty has been. Now, does that mean there's no poverty in India? Absolutely not. And that's the second thing we want to talk about, is that, hooray, absolute poverty is down. But there's another term that's called relative poverty. So absolute poverty, as I say, here's this line, $2 a day. If I'm below it, absolute poverty. Above it, not absolute poverty. Relative poverty means poverty relative to the place that you live. So, for example, if I live in the United States and I'm making, I don't know, $30,000 a year, that's poverty. It's just not absolute poverty. It's more than $2 a day. But $30,000 a year in the United States is not going to get you very far. So what we say is, given the conditions of that place, are you in poverty? And we call that relative poverty. So what we see is that even though absolute poverty in the developing world, like China and India, is going way down, that doesn't mean poverty is going away. Relative poverty is increasing in those areas. So if we count both people in absolute poverty and relative poverty from 1990 till now, that there's been a decline, but nowhere near what we would say was on that last slide, which looked like poverty's being beaten all over the place. So let's talk about some of these theories. We're going to look at 4 theories. You're going to start by looking at Vietnam. How's Vietnam sort of improved its economy?